The only way to explore such a map, to know it intimately, was on foot, or in a Humvee with the troops themselves. For even as elites in New York and Washington debated imperialism in grand historical terms, individual Marines, soldiers, airmen, and sailors were interpreting policy on their own, on the ground, in dozens upon dozens of countries every week. This was true of both officers and enlisted men, for while generals were involved at the tactical level as never before, the actions of the lowliest corporals and privates could be of great strategic impact under the spotlight of the global media. It was their stories I wanted to tell, from the ground up, at the point of contact. I was less concerned with war and conquest than with imperial maintenance on the ground, and seeking a rule book for its application. The project would take years. I had the earth to roam. It could not be the work of one book, but of several. Here is the first. Before I recount my odyssey through the barracks and outposts of the American Empire, I must address the issue of imperialism itself, a word with which most are uncomfortable and about which there has been much recent debate. Imperialism is but a form of isolationism, in which the demand for absolute, undefiled security at home leads one to conquer the world, and in the process to become subject to all the world's anxieties. That is why empires arise at the fringes of consciousness, half in denial. By the time an imperial reality becomes truly manifest, it is a sign that the apex of empire is at hand, with a gradual retreat more likely than fresh conquests. Rome never consciously thought that it was building an empire until it already had one, and had already reached the limits of its expansion. British imperialism in India reached its highest level of self-consciousness at the turn of the 20th century, just as the British Empire was becoming impractical. Empires are works in progress, with necessity rather than glory the instigator of each outward push. The Venetian conquest of Dalmatia in 1000 began as an expedition against pirates. The British acquired Bermuda in 1684 to guard a stretch of the Atlantic. The American Empire progressed likewise. As both a dream and a fact, the American Empire was born before the United States, writes Bernard DeVoto, the lyrical historian of westward expansion. Following their initial settlement, and before their incorporation as states in the Union, the Western territories were nothing less than imperial possessions of Washington, D.C. But it was not inevitable that the United States should have an empire in the western part of the continent. That destiny was brought by small groups of frontiersmen, separated from each other by great distances, making alliances with some Indian tribes and buying the neutrality of others. It was they who provided just enough weight to turn and keep the balance American, writes DeVoto. The result, he goes on, was an imperialist drama in delicate equipoises, constantly oscillating. He might have been describing the American military deployments of the early 21st century as I experienced them, for while the entire planet was a battle space for the American military, I would learn that the fewer troops that policed it, the better. Small, light, and lethal units of soldiers and Marines, skilled in guerrilla warfare and attuned to the local environment in the way of the 19th century Apaches, could accomplish more than dinosauric, industrial-age infantry divisions. Despite the building of the Panama Canal, one of those rare, conscious feats of empire building accomplished by President Theodore Roosevelt, it was also not inevitable that America should have become a preeminent global power. What would the United States have become without Adolf Hitler and Hideki Tojo? It was those dictators and the men around them who forced the U.S. out of its self-imposed isolation in order to meet the security threat posed by Nazism and Japanese militarism. The unintended consequences of successfully meeting those challenges included the encampment of the Soviet Red Army in the heart of Europe and a civil war in China that brought a communist regime to power. New threats which led to further American imperial expansion. 4 decades later, the victory over communism led to more unintended consequences. Breaking the will of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan in the 1980s meant the arming of radical Islamic guerrillas, who subsequently turned against the great power that had helped sustain them. the United States. Henceforth, Islamic terrorism became the sharp edge of a seeping anarchy that followed in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Empire in Eurasia and of the decomposition of states created by European empires on other continents. Even before the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon on September 11, 2001, the U.S. Army's Special Operations Command was conducting operations in 170 countries per year. America's reach was long, its involvement in the obscurest states protean. Rather than the mass conscript army of citizen soldiers that fought World War II, there was now a professional military that, true to other imperial forces throughout history, enjoyed the soldiering life for its own sake. For many of those professional troops, the 21st century looked strikingly similar to the middle and latter half of the 19th. When volunteer cavalry and dragoons subdued a panoply of mobile guerrilla forces, composed of different North American Indian tribes, operating throughout the new American empire west of the Mississippi River. Whereas the average American at the dawn of the new millennium found patriotic inspiration in the legacies of the Civil War and World War II, for many commissioned and non-commissioned officers, the U.S. Army's defining moment was fighting the Indians. The range of Indian groups, numbering in the hundreds, that the cavalry and dragoons had to confront was no less varied than that of the warring ethnic and religious militias spread throughout Eurasia, Africa, and South America in the early 21st century. It included Pawnees in Nebraska, Arapahoes in eastern Colorado, Cheyennes and Arikaras in South Dakota, Crows, Blackfeet, Flatheads, Snakes, and Cayuses in the Northwest, and many more throughout the country. The North American Indians were a throwback to the nomadic horse peoples of the Eurasian steppe. 2, they invite comparison with another imperial nemesis, the 19th century Pashtuns and Afridis of the northwest frontier of British India, who were subdivided into various khels, and about whom a young Winston Churchill, a subaltern and newspaper correspondent, wrote, "Tribe wars with tribe. The people of one valley fight with those of the next. Every man's hand is against the other, and all against the stranger." Beyond the Mississippi and Missouri rivers, the American military found a Hobbesian world in which internecine ethnic warfare, motivated by the competition for territory and resources, was the primary fact of life. Just as the stirring poetry and novels of Rudyard Kipling celebrated the work of British imperialism, the American artist Frederick Remington, in his bronze sculptures and oil paintings, would do likewise for the conquest of the Wild West. Remington was a figure of enduring cultural importance to Army officers I met in the course of my travels. Remington rode with the troops on scouting forays. His snapshots in oil idealized solitary men, the essence of hardihood and endurance, caught on the naked plain. Stern-faced cavalry officers confront Indians depicted in hot red and yellow colors, their horses in full gallop. It is a world of mixed-blood scouts clad in buckskin, of mountain men and pathfinders whose spirit of adventure is the maker of commonwealths, to quote that great Remington admirer, Theodore Roosevelt. In Remington's mythic universe, those early imperialists, the cavalry officers and pathfinders, appropriated the warrior ideal of their Indian enemy, which was marked by bravery and steadfastness. While microscopic in size, it was the fast and irregular military actions against the Indians, memorialized in bronze and oil by Remington, that shaped the nature of American nationalism. America's oft-noted optimistic ecumenicism, the basis for peace and disarmament movements, was largely limited to the northeast of the United States, writes the British war historian Sir Michael Howard. Further west and south, Howard goes on in a mightily perceptive passage, quite another spirit began to predominate. The experience of settlement, frontier defense, and territorial extension was producing a war culture. It assumed no progress toward a peaceful global society, but a continued struggle in which the use of violence was justified by individual conscience and brute necessity. A century or so later, when global organization began to appear possible,